What's up, guys? Did you ever play one of those games that always thought it was going to be the next big thing? In an era when licensed games were little more than disposable distractions, Spawn Armageddon set its sights high, aiming to stand shoulder to shoulder with Devil May Cry. But hell doesn't reward ambition, and for all the noise it made, the silence that followed was deafening. Critics trashed it, players moved on, and like its Hellborn hero, the game was condemned, forgotten, and left to die. But far beneath the surface, beyond the lackluster gameplay, and buried under a pile of glaring flaws, lies something far more unexpected. A game that, despite everything working against it, just might deserve a second look. This is the game that crawled out of hell and was sent straight back down. Welcome to Under the Spotlight. Spawn Armageddon released November 2003 for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube, and was met with heavy criticism from both fans and critics alike. While many agreed that it was a more than acceptable comic book adaptation, especially for the time, many felt that the game was lacking or completely missed the bar in several areas, most of them key components in turning an okay experience into something memorable. Though it still remains a beloved title by many fans, it's hard to argue that the game isn't far from perfect. And that's likely because it began as a concept born from a last-minute addition to a game that had nothing to do with Spawn. Sorta. A year before the game's release, series creator Todd McFarlane was hard at work collaborating with Namco on their ever-popular franchise, Soul Calibur. The inaugural release under the series' new name was a major hit, and Namco wanted to move quickly to capitalize on the momentum by releasing a sequel, aiming to deliver deeper gameplay and expanded content. Todd was approached by the company to create a brand new character for the series. His creation would become the infamous Necrid, one of the most controversial fighters in Soul Calibur history. Development was going pretty smooth, and the new fighter was almost ready, but the team still felt the game needed something more. Even though it was called Soul Calibur 2, this was technically the third game in the series, since the original was released as Soul Edge. And if the sequel didn't step things up, fans were bound to lose interest. Luckily, the timing couldn't have been better. The console wars were heating up, and players were super loyal to their platform of choice. So the team ran with it. Each console would get its own exclusive fighter, a familiar face to hype up the fan base, and give each version of the game its own little twist. It wasn't a tough call for 2 out of the 3 platforms. The PlayStation 2 would feature Heihachi Mishima from Tekken, and the GameCube would get Link from The Legend of Zelda. But the Xbox, well, that was trickier. Master Chief didn't quite fit the Soul Calibur mold, and Conquer was still 3 years away from landing on the platform. Imagine. But it didn't take long for them to realize there was only one character worthy of claiming the throne as Xbox's exclusive fighter, one of the most iconic and violent figures in comic book history, Spawn. Even though his inclusion seemed to be a no-brainer, they still had to get Todd's okay. The contract he signed didn't cover using his main character, so the team had to reach out to him directly and hope he'd say yes. Thankfully, he did! And with that, Spawn joined Soul Calibur's exclusive roster, rekindling McFarlane's love for his character and leaving him deeply impressed with how well Project Soul had adapted Spawn into their 3D world. Todd was so impressed with their work that he quickly began talks with the team at Namco about bringing Spawn to the then next generation of consoles with his own release. This was a dream come true for Namco. All they'd hoped for was Spawn's inclusion when they approached Todd, but instead, they walked out of that meeting as the developers of a brand new Spawn video game. Without hesitation, the team agreed to Todd's proposition, and thanks to the strong relationship between both parties, development began almost immediately. Though details about the development period for Spawn Armageddon are scarce, it's well known that the game received Todd's stamp of approval at every stage, and that it went from concept to shelf in barely more than a year. And therein, in the rush of creation, lies both the fire that gave Spawn Armageddon life and the slow burn that ultimately led to its death. A year might be enough to rush something out the door and onto store shelves, but it's rarely enough time to get things right, and Spawn Armageddon wears those growing pains on its sleeve. The game's development cycle lasted barely more than a calendar year, and that limited timeline is likely the root cause of many issues fans still point to today. Simplified combat, repetitive enemies, and uninspired levels are just the tip of the iceberg, but nearly every flaw present in Armageddon could have been avoided, or at least improved, if the team had just been given a little more time to work on the game. For starters, the game blatantly aims to be a Devil May Cry clone, but instead of taking notes, or the devs actually playing Devil May Cry, they just glanced at the cover art and said, yeah, we got this, because half of the DMC formula made it in, and the other half, Spawn. Armageddon leans way too hard on that one half of the formula. With so much missing from gameplay, it kinda feels like the game was just hoping Spawn's name alone would save it, but it doesn't even really do that. This is primarily because the story isn't impressive by even the most charitable standards. It's an absolute train wreck. Drawing from an overwhelming range of issues 1 through 90 in the Spawn comic run, the game tries to weave a narrative using nearly a decade of lore. Instead of carving out a focused storyline, it grabs whatever it can carry and hurls it at the player with little rhyme, reason, or explanation. The result is a plot that feels more like a highlight reel than a cohesive story, with levels leaping randomly between major comic events without giving the player any real context.
That's as clear as I can make it.
Honestly, even if you're familiar with the comics, the story here just confuses you and makes you feel like you're missing some important pieces. It's so vague and unfocused that maybe the game would have been better off without any story at all and just doubling down on the combat instead. But the combat isn't much to write home about either. Whether or not it's actually possible for a game to feel both fluid and clunky at the same time doesn't really matter, because Spawn Armageddon manages to do exactly that. Throughout your entire playthrough, Spawn has just one 3-hit combo, no upgrades, no expansions, and no real combo system to back it up. As if in attempt to patch the glaring absence of a proper combo system, the game does throw in 2 alternate axe attacks, both locked behind its clunky targeting mechanics. The first, and most personally useless, is the axe uppercut, performed by locking on, pressing down on the analog stick, and attacking. This move is occasionally helpful, by which I mean it's only useful against one specific enemy, because the slow animation makes it feel almost unusable in most combat scenarios. The second alternate move is the axe ground slam. If you press up on the analog stick while attacking and locked on, Spawn performs a super heroic front flip and slams his axe on the ground, dealing decent damage to any enemies caught in the path, if it even connects at all, thanks to the game's hitboxes. Before we dive any further into combat, I do have to mention the hitboxes because they're absolutely annoying. They're maddeningly inconsistent and make even a casual grasp of the combat system frustratingly difficult. Stuns and knockdowns are the most common forms of crowd control, both given and received in the game, and what would be a normal mechanic becomes something that can ruin your experience thanks to this inconsistency. And it doesn't help that Spawn's sluggish animations offer no moments of invulnerability, which not only adds to the frustration, it makes him feel less like Al Simmons the Hellspawn and more like Alan Simmons, the semi-pro vigilante.
Am I getting catfished here, or any powers you want to tell us about?
I have both type 1 and 2 diabetes.
Something that hit your target just 2 seconds ago suddenly doesn't, even though you repeat the exact same move from the exact same spot, which gives your target an unfortunate window of opportunity to hit you with a stun. But you dodged it, until you didn't, and suddenly you're sprawled on the ground getting hit by another stun, and another stun, and another stun, and another. To be fair, stun locks and missed attacks from wonky hitboxes don't happen all the time, but they pop up often enough to nudge players into trying out combat tactics that just don't feel right for the game or the character. Gameplay frequently devolves into nothing more than a game of cat and mouse, where you more often than not run around the map in circles while firing at enemies just far away enough to be out of range for any damaging attack. And this doesn't just apply to general combat, it consistently applies of varying degrees to mini and main boss fights as well. And although the boss fights aren't bad by any means, they feel incredibly underwhelming and rarely as impactful or meaningful as a fight for some of these bosses should. Two of the best examples I can give are the Violator boss and the Bulldozer mini boss fights. Both give off the kind of presence you'd expect from a serious challenge, but Violator ends up being easier than the tutorial mission, and the Bulldozer fight is just a slightly more contained version of the same old game of cat and mouse. Objectively speaking, these aren't deal breakers. Run and gun gameplay is wildly popular, and not every boss needs to be Dark Souls level difficult to be enjoyable. But in this case, I'd argue the opposite. The presence of a run-and-gun playstyle would make a lot more sense if this took place during Spawn's Gunslinger arc, but it doesn't, and those laughably easy boss fights would make much more sense if they weren't incredibly powerful demons. But they are! This is the version of Spawn who is ruthlessly, viciously hunting anything in his path, all in the desperate hope of seeing his wife again. Fights often leading him to confronting Satan himself. So it feels especially strange to be more inclined to run away from enemies when the comic book Spawn, the exact one this game is based on, would do the complete opposite. It makes this version of Spawn feel less like the brutal anti-hero fans know and love, and more like a cowering vigilante who leans too heavily on ranged combat and keeps his distance when he should be tearing through Hellspawn with unrelenting brutality. But despite my feelings on the issue, I hate to admit, this game's actually a lot of fun. In all fairness, it isn't really a good game. Objectively speaking, it's clunky, it's shallow, and it's barely more than a flashy visual ride. But one of the biggest things working in its favor, and ironically what I think is one of its most redeeming qualities, is just how many of Spawn's powers and guns you get to mess around with. I'm not the biggest fan of how the game just hands you all of Spawn's powers right from the start. I think it would have made a lot more sense and been way more satisfying to unlock them gradually, maybe by beating bosses or clearing milestone levels. This slight adjustment would have both added another layer of progression for the character and a sense of extra achievement for the player. Now, it's not the worst thing in the world to have them all available from the beginning. It is fun to play around with them early on, but because you get access to everything so soon, the game never really pushes you to experiment with each individual power. You'll likely just pick one high damage power, or maybe his shields, and then just forget the rest exist. If the game had any real depth in its leveling or progression systems, this wouldn't be a problem. But since those mechanics are about as deep as a Discord mod, what should be a non-issue ends up feeling like a missed opportunity. You may have noticed that I said another layer of progression. That's because the game does have a system in place, it's just one that's so critically underwhelming and useless that I didn't even know it existed until the last level of the game. As you play through the game and defeat enemies, they'll occasionally drop souls. You can also earn souls by using specific moves or weapons on certain enemies, but honestly, how you get them doesn't matter. What does matter is that souls are your only way to upgrade anything in Armageddon, and the only place you can spend them is through a clunky upgrade menu hidden in the mission start screen. It's easy to miss entirely. I didn't even notice it until the final level of the game, and even if you do find it earlier, the upgrades are so underwhelming they feel more like a checkbox than meaningful progress. Just enough to pretend there's depth, but not enough to actually matter. Obviously, when you upgrade your health, you clearly gain more hit points, and gun upgrades do increase the amount of bullets they hold, but what little you gain is slowly taken away as you get lost in a level and waste all your resources trying to figure out where the hell spawn to go. And you can thank poor level design for that. While most of the game is fairly linear, just a simple go from point A to point B with some obstacles along the way, there are some, 2 levels in particular, that will make you seriously consider quitting before finishing the game. I won't spoil anything for those who want to play it, but the subway and the Angel Station levels are easily 2 of the most frustrating, confusing, and downright miserable experiences I've ever had in a game. With a YouTube guide, you'll do okay, and honestly, I would recommend having one handy because getting lost or stuck on your first run is almost guaranteed, which is really unfortunate because the levels themselves aren't inherently difficult. Once you figure out the intended path or pattern, they're pretty straightforward to finish. But because the visual design is so bland, every room just ends up looking exactly the same. And in the train and Angel Station levels specifically, you're forced to slog through a maze of near identical spaces, turning the whole thing into a tedious chore. It seriously sucks that this is the state Spawn Armageddon was released in, because the formula for a fun game is clearly here. And with enough effort, you will have a good time with this game, but it doesn't feel like the formula ever made it out of the conceptual phase. The visuals are great, especially for the time, and there definitely is some level of charm with Spawn Armageddon, but the game at its core is lacking in so many ways, it's hard to determine whether or not this is an experience I think is worth spending a weekend on. At the surface, it's a boring, repetitive Devil May Cry clone that cared more about capitalizing on the popularity of the Spawn brand rather than make a good video game that happens to feature Spawn. But deep down, the game has some merit as a pick up and put down action adventure game. Combat isn't what I wish it could be, but it offers just enough to give you the right amount of toys in its sandbox to have a fun experience. Most of the fun I had with Spawn Armageddon was found in seeing how fast I could any percent and then 100% a level, and I think that's the approach most should take with this game, because the reality is it doesn't have the pieces it needs to carry itself as a respectable contender to Devil May Cry. But it does have just the right pieces to breathe some life into this game as a speedrunning experience. Though it struggles to carry itself as a good, much less a fun action game, there's enough substance here that, with the right approach, can make for a fairly decent experience. And let's be honest, it's pretty fun to beat shit up as Spawn. Spawn Armageddon isn't exactly a game I'd outright recommend everybody play, especially if you aren't already a Spawn fan. But for those I do recommend, it's the perfect time to get a copy. At the time of recording, you can find a loose PlayStation 2 copy for as little as $15, and a complete Xbox version for around $25, with the GameCube version tending to be the priciest overall. Despite delivering an underwhelming experience, I think there's just enough here to give it my own stamp of approval if you can snag it for $30 or less. Though if you're not a fan of action games or Spawn himself, I'd suggest exploring other methods of consuming the game before spending any real money. But if you're a Spawn fan, I honestly don't see why this shouldn't have a place on your shelf. Spawn as a character has an incredibly rich history, as does his creator. And let's face it, it's been over 20 years since Spawn last had a video game of his own, this being that game. And it's been even longer since we've seen him on the big screen. Sadly, judging by how things have been going, outside of some random collaborations, it looks like we're not going to be seeing something new anytime soon. Armageddon is very much a game of its time. It struggles with plenty of issues that kept it from reaching the spotlight it might have deserved, and as much as I hope it's not true, there is a real chance that this was Spawn's last shot to shine in the gaming world. So let's not remember it for what it was or what it could have been. Let's remember it for what it is. A pretty bad game that's pretty damn fun.
And then how do you pronounce this fucking name? Heihachi Mishima? Yeah. The PlayStation 2 would feature Heihachi Mishima.